up, everybody? Welcome to our second episode of Deep Dives. And this past Sunday, we were in, I think, our 8th message of the kingdom according to Genesis. And we really looked at part 2 of God's covenant with Noah and the flood and some of the aftermath of that. And so we wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive into kind of the aftermath. God's made this covenant with Noah, and we get this kind of strange story at the end of it. Essentially what happens here, this is Genesis 9 verses 18 through 27. And essentially what happens is Noah has found dry land. He plants a vineyard. He's exceedingly thankful to God for sparing his life, the life of his sons and his sons' wives, and Noah's wife as well. And so Noah plants a vineyard, and once the fruit of the vine becomes wine, he starts to partake, and he has too much. Noah becomes drunk, and he's naked. And so we get this story in verse 21, where Noah drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers," and so on that curse goes. There's a couple of things at play worth addressing here. So at one hand, historically, there used to be an interpretation of this passage where it was called the curse of Ham. And if you look at the table of nations that appears in Genesis chapter 10, you see that the descendants of Ham, many of them inhabit what is today northern Africa. And so at the introduction of the transatlantic slave trade, you had a lot of Christians and ministers and pastors at the time and theologians at the time who, in order to justify the practice of slavery, would see the curse of Ham as being applied to the presence of black skin. And so theologically, slaves were taught that you have this curse from God that has made you have dark skin, and therefore it is right for us to enslave you. Now, first refutation of that, which I think is quite clearly, the curse isn't on Ham as a whole, but rather the curse is on Ham's son, and Ham's son is Canaan. Now, the text doesn't indicate exactly why the curse falls on Canaan and not on Ham. Secondly, we don't get any indication anywhere in Scripture that this curse manifests itself in skin color. Rather, we get the exact opposite, where there's a celebration throughout the Bible, even in the Old Testament, of the variety of cultures and ethnicities and nations coming together for the praises of God. And so this was clearly a manipulation of the text used to oppress people wrongfully by a misinterpretation of Scripture. A couple other things to note here. So what is it that Ham did that brought this curse on him from God? There are some who interpret verse 22 that Canaan saw the nakedness of his father and interpret that as some kind of a homosexual relationship that Ham pursued with his dad. Again, that's a little bit of a stretch linguistically to arrive at that conclusion. Some also insert that, kind of avoiding the homosexual interpretation, would say that Ham, seeing Noah naked, went and slept with his mom, so that there was kind of an incestual relationship going on there. Again, nothing in the text would lead us to that conclusion, but rather when you take it at the word level, he saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. I think when you think through this thematically, we can remember back again, Genesis being one book, one consistent narrative being told by the same author. The last time we saw nakedness emerge was back in the garden. Adam and Eve were created in that state. Genesis 2:25 closes with the line that Adam and Eve were naked and they were unashamed. Well, we see Genesis 3 where the serpent emerges as this antagonistic figure who brings shame and guilt for Adam and Eve's nakedness. They go and they partake in the fruit of the tree that they're not supposed to, and they see that they're naked and they become ashamed of that. Well, later on in that passage as well, we see that God sacrifices an animal on behalf of Adam and Eve, and he clothes them after they realize that they're naked. And so I think that the clearest parallel, given that the story has already given us this just a few chapters earlier, is that what Shem and Japheth do is they cover their father's nakedness. And this is what God does for us. This is what Jesus does for us, very figuratively in the New Testament, that as he dies on the cross and on our behalf, he clothes us in righteousness. You almost see that parallel again in the Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 through 14 parable of the wedding feast. At the very end, the man is cast out because he's not wearing the proper wedding clothes. So this idea of being clothed in righteousness from the sacrifice of Jesus is very prominent in Scripture, and I believe that that's what this text is getting at. And so as the Bible plays on, again in Genesis chapter 10, we see this table of nations, and you see that the descendants of Canaan include the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites. If you're not knowing who those are, these are the people who inhabit the promised land prior to Israel getting there, and they're the enemies that they have to overcome. And so the clearest reading of this passage and of this text is Noah had too much to drink, allowed his drunkenness to overcome him, falls asleep naked, and Ham brought shame on him by going and telling his brothers, exploiting his father's nakedness, rather than clothing and covering him, which seems to be the biblical and most Christ-like thing to do. And we see the ramifications of that is that the people of Canaan end up becoming enemies of Israel, just like the serpent was the enemy of Adam and Eve and the enemy of God. But what we also see beautifully as Scripture moves on is that these Canaanite people and all Gentiles and all nations are brought back into the fold with this clothed righteousness of Jesus Christ, where his blood covers a multitude of sins, where it's his blood that draws in a multitude of people, and it's his sacrifice that unifies, that unites us all together, eliminating this separation. And so I hope as you read this text and maybe a little bit of confusion arises, what is this curse of Canaan about? What happened there? You're able to see that Ham took on the role of the serpent, exploiting his father's nakedness, but rather we're to look to people like Shem and Japheth, who mirror Jesus Christ, who is to come, who clothes us, covers our nakedness, so that we too might be righteous. I hope this helps. Have a blessed week. We'll see you next time.